0.2 cents per kilowatt hour. That is what Hydro-Quebec has been paying Newfoundland and Labrador for electricity generated at Churchill Falls, one of the largest hydroelectric plants on the entire continent, for 57 years. Not 57 cents, not 5.7 cents, 0.2 cents, a fraction of what that power has actually been worth on the open market for decades, under a contract signed in 1969 that was scheduled to keep running at that exact rate until 2041. On August 17, 2026, that contract effectively died, not at its scheduled expiry 15 years from now, but right now, replaced by a new agreement between Quebec, Newfoundland and Labrador, and the federal government that multiplies the price Quebec pays by more than 30 times and unlocks a $50 billion wave of new hydroelectric and wind construction across Labrador. If you want to understand how one of the most lopsided energy contracts in modern history finally got torn up, and why it took nearly 6 decades and 3 separate attempts to actually kill it, stay with this, because the numbers behind this specific deal are almost too extreme to believe until you see exactly how they were calculated. Let's go back to where this contract actually began, because the story of how Newfoundland ended up trapped inside it for half a century explains everything about why undoing it turned out to be this difficult. In 1969, Newfoundland and Labrador signed a power purchase agreement with Hydro-Quebec covering the electricity generated at Churchill Falls, a massive hydroelectric facility built in central Labrador, specifically to harness the Churchill River's enormous drop in elevation. The contract locked in a price of roughly 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour for the bulk of that facility's output, running for 65 years, all the way through August 31st, 2041. At the time it was signed, that price may have looked reasonable enough against the electricity markets of the late 1960s. It did not stay reasonable for long. As energy prices climbed through the following decades, and as Quebec resold that same Churchill Falls power at vastly higher rates both domestically and into export markets across the northeastern United States, the gap between what Newfoundland received and what Quebec actually earned from reselling that power became almost impossible to describe, without sounding like an exaggeration. By 2019, independent estimates placed Quebec's cumulative profit from the arrangement at roughly $28 billion, compared with just $2 billion flowing back to Newfoundland and Labrador over that same half-century stretch. The contract became, and remained for decades, the single most contentious point of grievance between the two provinces. A fixed, unbreakable legal agreement that Newfoundland's own courts and even the Supreme Court of Canada had repeatedly upheld as valid, however lopsided its terms had become over time. That legal reality is the part of this story most people miss, and it matters enormously for understanding why this dispute dragged on for as long as it did. Newfoundland and Labrador did not simply choose to keep honoring an unfair deal out of politeness or inertia. The province spent years attempting to challenge the contract's terms directly through the courts, arguing at various points that Hydro-Quebec had a duty to renegotiate, given how dramatically circumstances had changed since 1969. Those legal challenges consistently failed because Canadian contract law generally does not allow a court to rewrite a valid, freely negotiated agreement simply because one party later regrets the terms it originally accepted, regardless of how extreme the imbalance eventually became. That legal wall is precisely why Newfoundland spent decades essentially locked into this exact price, with no path forward except somehow convincing Quebec itself voluntarily that renegotiating made sense for both sides. Newfoundland and Labrador's total budget this year sits at roughly $10.4 billion, and the province carries a net debt of approximately $17.7 billion. Figures that make the scale of what this contract has cost the province over half a century easier to grasp in real terms. An additional $1 billion in annual revenue is not a marginal budgetary line item for a government operating at that scale. It represents a meaningful percentage of the province's entire annual budget, arriving every single year for the better part of 2 decades. Getting Quebec to that point took an enormous, patient, multi-decade shift in incentives, one that only really came together once Quebec started facing a problem of its own that Newfoundland happened to hold the solution to. That shift in Quebec's own incentives is where this story genuinely turns, and it centers on a looming energy shortfall that had very little to do with fairness and everything to do with Quebec's own long-term electricity math. The 1969 contract's fixed 2041 expiry date, once viewed as a distant, almost theoretical horizon, started looking increasingly urgent to Quebec's planners as the province's own electricity demand climbed, driven by population growth, industrial expansion, and a broader North American push toward electrification. Hydro-Quebec derives the bulk of its profits from exactly this Churchill Falls arrangement, and losing guaranteed access to that supply in 2041 threatened to leave the province facing a genuine future energy shortfall at precisely the moment demand was rising fastest. Former Quebec Premier François Legault became the first Quebec leader to seriously consider revising the contract voluntarily, recognizing that locking in guaranteed access to Churchill Falls power beyond 2041, even at a dramatically higher price than the original 1969 terms, was worth far more to Quebec's long-term energy security than continuing to extract maximum short-term value from an agreement with a hard, fixed, unmovable expiration date. Now, here's a rehook worth sitting with, because it explains why the first serious attempt at fixing this nearly collapsed entirely before ever becoming real. In December 2024, Legault and then Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey announced what both leaders described as a genuine breakthrough, a memorandum of understanding designed to replace the 1969 contract entirely, not wait for its scheduled 2041 expiry. Furey did not mince words at the announcement, declaring, "We are ripping up the 1969 contract, not 2041 when it expires, but today." Under that initial framework, Quebec agreed to pay roughly 30 times more for Churchill Falls power than the original contract rate. A shift Newfoundland and Labrador officials projected would net the province an additional $1 billion annually through 2041, adding up to roughly $17 billion in total new provincial revenue. The framework also included new generation capacity, an expanded facility at Churchill Falls itself, and a brand new hydroelectric station at Gull Island, a long-discussed site on the same river system that had never been developed due to the financing and political complexity involved. Hydro-Quebec, in its own statement at the time, described the deal cautiously, calling it non-binding, and intended only to guide future discussions, language that turned out to be more prophetic than anyone realized in the moment. As of 2023, when Legault first traveled to Newfoundland and Labrador specifically to open renewal talks, the arrangement had already generated roughly $28 billion in profit for Quebec since the plant first came online, against just $2 billion flowing to Newfoundland and Labrador over that same stretch, according to figures compiled at the time. Nearly all of Churchill Falls' electricity output was sold under the fixed 1969 terms directly to Hydro-Quebec, which then resold that same power both to its own domestic ratepayers and into lucrative export contracts across the northeastern United States, capturing virtually the entire margin between the rock-bottom contracted price and whatever the actual market would bear at any given moment. That resale arrangement is precisely what made the contract feel so viscerally unfair to generations of Newfoundlanders watching their own province's natural resource generate enormous wealth for a neighboring government's utility, wealth that Newfoundland itself had essentially no legal claim to under the terms it had signed decades earlier. Newfoundland and Labrador had, by that point, already established a formal provincial panel tasked specifically with preparing the province for whatever came after the contract's scheduled 2041 expiry, examining how the province could finally capture more value from its own resource once the original terms naturally ran their course. Work that ended up directly informing the province's negotiating position once Legault's outreach turned the timeline from 2041 into something happening right now instead. That caution proved warranted because the political ground underneath this agreement shifted dramatically within less than a year. Newfoundland and Labrador held a provincial election in October 2025, and progressive conservative leader Tony Wakeham built part of his campaign directly around skepticism toward the Furey-Legault memorandum, promising a referendum on the agreement in principle and demanding an independent expert review before any final commitment. Wakeham won that election, and once in office, he moved quickly to make good on that specific campaign promise. His government commissioned an independent review committee to examine the 2024 memorandum in detail, and by spring 2026, the committee reached a conclusion that effectively killed the original framework in its existing form, determining plainly that the Memorandum of Understanding was not in the public interest as written. That finding sent both provinces back to the negotiating table, this time with an entirely new Newfoundland and Labrador premier who had explicitly built his political mandate around getting a better deal than the one his predecessor had already celebrated as historic. Wakeham's own path to that moment is worth understanding in more detail, because it shapes exactly how skeptically he approached the entire renegotiation process once he actually took office. As opposition leader during the original 4-day legislative debate over the 2024 memorandum, Wakeham had already criticized the process directly, calling it outrageous that Newfoundland and Labrador's legislature was being asked to debate the agreement without the benefit of any independent expert review, a criticism that foreshadowed almost exactly what his own government would later commission once he won power. That consistency, opposing the deal's process before the election, and then following through on exactly the review he had demanded once he actually held the authority to order one, gave his eventual renegotiation effort a level of political credibility with Newfoundland voters that a less consistent approach might not have earned. The renegotiation that followed took months of quiet, largely unpublicized work, But by mid-August 2026, sources close to the discussions confirmed to reporters that Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador were closing in on a substantially revised agreement, with only 2 or 3 outstanding issues left to resolve before a formal announcement. That announcement came on August 17, 2026, delivered jointly by Prime Minister Mark Carney, Quebec Premier Christine Frechette, who had taken over Quebec's own leadership amid a provincial election campaign of her own, and Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Tony Wakeham, standing together in St. John's to unveil what officials on all 3 sides described using strikingly similar language, a win-win-win. Wakeham's own framing captured the emotional weight of the moment for a province that had spent 57 years watching its own natural resource generate enormous wealth almost entirely for someone else. We are finally replacing the notorious 1969 Churchill Falls deal and the 2024 memorandum with a new and better deal that will guarantee us more power, more value, and more transmission, he said. The actual numbers inside this new agreement dwarf even the ambitious 2024 framework that Wakeham himself had originally rejected as insufficient. Under the new terms, Newfoundland and Labrador gains access to more than 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity, representing more than a quarter of Hydro-Quebec's entire current output, a dramatic expansion compared to the 7,200 megawatts contemplated under the original 2024 memorandum. Combined across all the projects included in the agreement, total new generating capacity approaches 14,000 megawatts, nearly tripling Churchill Falls' current output entirely. Quebec will pay an average price of 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour for this power, a figure that sounds modest in isolation, until you remember it represents more than 30 times the 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour Quebec paid under the original 1969 terms for nearly 6 decades. The agreement calls for a major expansion of the existing Churchill Falls generating station, adding 1.275 gigawatts of new capacity there alone, alongside construction of an entirely new 2.7 gigawatt hydroelectric complex at Gull Island, a 2 gigawatt wind complex situated near Churchill Falls itself, and a new high-voltage transmission line named the Labrador Western Transmission Line, designed specifically to connect all of this new capacity directly into Quebec's existing electrical grid. To put the scale of this new generating capacity in terms that are easier to grasp than raw megawatt figures, the total potential output across these combined projects, based on average household energy consumption, would be enough to supply somewhere between 5 million and 9 million homes. That range alone exceeds the entire population of several Canadian provinces combined, underscoring just how significant a piece of North American energy infrastructure this single river system is capable of producing once fully built out. The Labrador Western Transmission Line specifically matters because Churchill Falls and the surrounding project sites sit in one of the most remote, sparsely populated regions of eastern Canada, meaning the physical infrastructure required simply to move this power from where it's generated to where it can actually be used represents its own massive engineering undertaking, layered entirely on top of the already enormous cost of building the generating stations themselves. The financing structure behind this agreement is worth understanding in detail because it reveals just how significant a role the federal government played in finally making this deal politically survivable for all 3 parties involved. Ottawa has committed $10 billion in direct federal financing. Toward these combined projects, money the federal government says is specifically designed to help attract additional private and public investment on top of that initial public commitment. Total projected investment across the full slate of hydro, wind, and transmission projects touted in the agreement reaches roughly $50 billion, and some officials involved in the announcement suggested the ultimate figure could climb as high as $70 billion once every associated transmission and grid integration project across the river system is factored in, more than double what the original 2024 memorandum had ever contemplated. That scale of federal financial backing helps explain why this specific version of the agreement succeeded where the 2024 framework stalled, since it gave Newfoundland and Labrador's new government a materially different and considerably larger set of numbers to bring back to a skeptical electorate than what Fury had originally negotiated. Ottawa's involvement here fits inside a broader pattern the federal government has pursued repeatedly throughout 2026, using direct financial backing to help resolve exactly the kind of interprovincial disputes that provincial governments alone have historically struggled to settle without outside intervention. Federal officials have said the $10 billion commitment is specifically structured to help unlock additional private capital rather than to fund the entire project slate on its own, a common approach for infrastructure projects of this scale, where government financing serves primarily to reduce the risk profile enough that private lenders and institutional investors become willing to commit the much larger remaining sums required. given that total projected investment across the full agreement reaches into the tens of billions of dollars. The federal contribution represents a meaningful but still relatively modest fraction of the overall capital required, underscoring just how much additional private financing both provinces will still need to attract successfully in order to actually build everything this announcement promises. There's also a genuinely important piece of this deal that goes beyond simple price and megawatt figures, and it speaks directly to the core grievance that fueled 57 years of Newfoundland frustration in the first place. Wakeham specifically emphasized that the new agreement gives Newfoundland and Labrador considerably greater control over how its own electricity resources actually get used going forward, including the ability to decide whether power gets directed toward supporting economic development inside the province itself, rather than being automatically funneled south to Quebec and onward into American export markets, regardless of what Newfoundland's own needs might be at any given moment. That specific provision addresses something the original 1969 contract never allowed for at all: a total absence of provincial control over the disposition of a resource physically located inside Newfoundland and Labrador's own borders. The agreement also includes a co-investment component involving the Innu of Labrador, specifically tied to the new onshore wind project, giving an Indigenous community directly connected to the land where these projects are being built a formal ownership stake in the resulting infrastructure, rather than treating the surrounding communities as passive bystanders to a deal negotiated entirely between two provincial capitals. That specific inclusion reflects a broader shift in how major Canadian infrastructure projects have increasingly been structured over the past decade, moving away from a model where Indigenous communities located near resource development sites were consulted, at best, without any meaningful ownership or revenue-sharing stake in projects built on or near their traditional territories. The original 1969 Churchill Falls contract predated that shift entirely, negotiated at a time when neither Newfoundland's own government nor Quebec's gave serious consideration to Indigenous ownership stakes in major hydroelectric development, a gap this new agreement at least partially attempts to correct nearly 6 decades later. Whether the specific terms of that co-investment arrangement prove substantial enough to satisfy Innu leadership and community members, once the full details become public, will likely shape how this particular piece of the broader agreement gets received in the months ahead, separate entirely from how Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador voters judge the deal's core pricing and infrastructure terms. Here's what makes the political landscape around this specific announcement genuinely complicated, and why calling this a fully settled done deal would be premature even now. Quebec is currently in the middle of a provincial election campaign, and the timing of this announcement, arriving in the thick of that campaign, has already drawn visible skepticism from opposition parties. Quebec's Liberal Party and the provincial New Democratic Party have both signaled they are not yet fully sold on the specifics of the agreement, even while Premier Fréchette has publicly championed it as a major achievement for her government heading into the vote. Fréchette herself has stated plainly that the ultimate future of this Churchill Falls agreement genuinely hinges on the outcome of that election, an unusually candid acknowledgement from a sitting premier that a signature policy achievement she personally announced could still unravel depending entirely on whether voters return her party to power. That specific vulnerability echoes almost precisely what happened to the original 2024 memorandum, which collapsed not because of any flaw in its underlying economic logic, but because a change in government on the Newfoundland and Labrador side introduced political uncertainty the original negotiators had not adequately planned around. Whether this new, considerably larger agreement proves more durable against that same kind of political risk, now sitting on the Quebec side of the border instead, is a genuinely open question that will not be answered until Quebec's election concludes. The specific opposition emerging inside Quebec deserves a closer look because it is not simply reflexive partisan resistance to whatever the sitting government happens to announce. Quebec's Liberal Party and provincial New Democratic Party have both raised questions about the long-term cost implications of committing Quebec ratepayers to 30 times the previous contracted price, even while acknowledging that the original 1969 rate was never sustainable or fair over the long run. The criticism sits in an unusual position politically, since opposing the agreement risks being framed as defending an indefensible historical injustice, while supporting it wholesale before the election concedes a significant policy win to Fréchette's government at precisely the moment opposition parties are trying to make the case that Quebec deserves new leadership. That awkward positioning helps explain why both opposition parties have settled on a middle path, expressing openness to the deal's broad goals while withholding full endorsement of its specific financial terms until after voters have their say. There is also a broader national dimension to this specific announcement that connects directly to Canada's ongoing trade tensions with the United States, tensions that have dominated headlines throughout 2026 in an entirely separate but related context. Commentary published around the time of the announcement noted explicitly that this new energy partnership between Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec strengthens Prime Minister Carney's broader negotiating hand in trade talks with Washington, since it demonstrates Canada's capacity to build major new domestic energy infrastructure and strengthen internal interprovincial cooperation entirely independent of American markets or American investment. At a moment when Carney's government has spent much of the year navigating an aggressive American tariff regime under Section 338 of a nearly century-old trade statute, and simultaneously pursuing a broader strategy of reducing Canada's economic dependence on the United States through new trade agreements with countries like Ecuador and the United Arab Emirates, a $50 billion interprovincial clean energy partnership fits neatly into that same broader narrative of Canadian economic self-sufficiency, even though the Churchill Falls dispute itself long predates the current trade war by more than half a century. That connection is not merely rhetorical framing invented by commentators looking for a tidy narrative thread. Both provinces and the federal government have real, concrete incentives to demonstrate exactly this kind of large-scale internal cooperation right now, at a moment when Canada's broader economic relationship with its largest trading partner has grown genuinely uncertain across multiple fronts simultaneously. A major new clean energy corridor connecting Labrador's hydroelectric and wind resources directly into Quebec's grid, financed substantially by federal dollars and built through voluntary interprovincial agreement rather than federal imposition, offers exactly the kind of success story a government under sustained external economic pressure wants to be able to point to, a tangible demonstration that Canadian provinces can still solve their own long-standing disputes and build major shared infrastructure together, entirely independent of whatever happens in negotiations with Washington. What makes this specific resolution genuinely remarkable when you step back from the individual numbers is simply how long it took to get here and how many separate, sequential failures preceded this particular success. Newfoundland and Labrador first began seriously preparing for life after the 1969 contract's eventual 2041 expiry as early as 2022, establishing a formal provincial panel specifically tasked with examining how the province could maximize its own benefit once that contract finally ran its course naturally. Quebec's own interest in early renegotiation did not seriously materialize until Legault recognized the province's own looming supply shortfall, made waiting until 2041 a genuinely risky proposition for Quebec's own energy security, not just an act of goodwill toward a neighboring province. The first serious framework, signed in December 2024, collapsed within roughly 16 months once a change in Newfoundland and Labrador's own government introduced a level of political skepticism the original deal's architects had not planned for. And even this considerably larger, better financed successor agreement now depends on the outcome of a Quebec election still actively underway as this agreement gets announced. 57 years of a fixed, unbreakable, deeply lopsided contract does not get undone cleanly or quickly, even once every major party involved genuinely wants it gone, because the political incentives on both sides of any interprovincial negotiation this large rarely align cleanly at exactly the same moment for both governments simultaneously. So where does this actually leave Newfoundland and Labrador, and where does it leave Quebec, as this new agreement moves from announcement toward whatever comes next? For Newfoundland and Labrador, the immediate financial upside is substantial, regardless of exactly how the final numbers eventually settle, since even the more modest 2024 framework that Wakeham's own government rejected as insufficient had projected roughly $1 billion in additional annual provincial revenue, and this considerably larger successor agreement, built around triple the previous framework's generating capacity and backed by $10 billion in direct federal financing, should meaningfully exceed that figure once fully implemented. For Quebec, the calculation runs differently, but points toward the same basic conclusion, trading a temporary loss of the extraordinary. Profit margins the province enjoyed under the original 1969 terms in exchange for guaranteed, expanded long-term access to a massive new supply of clean hydroelectric and wind power, precisely at the moment the province's own electricity demand is climbing fastest. Both outcomes depend entirely on whether the political coalitions currently backing this agreement in St. John's, in Quebec City, and in Ottawa actually hold together long enough to see $50 billion worth of hydroelectric dams, wind turbines, and transmission lines actually get built across one of the most remote and challenging construction environments in North America. If this breakdown helped you understand how one of the most lopsided energy contracts in Canadian history finally got renegotiated after nearly 6 decades, subscribe so you catch what happens once Quebec's election results are in, and this agreement either moves forward or faces the same kind of political reversal that killed its predecessor. Drop a comment and tell us whether you think this new deal actually survives the political turbulence still ahead, or whether Churchill Falls ends up back at the negotiating table for a 4th time before a single new turbine ever spins. And if you know someone who thinks interprovincial disputes inside Canada are boring compared to the trade war with Washington, send them this, because 57 years and 30 times the price is a story that deserves just as much attention.